record on this computer, and it seems to be recording, so we're good to go.
All right. And there are a few other folks here. T. Banu. All right. We even get some cameras on. People are not camera shy. This is good.
I hope you hear me. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hello from Australia.
Hello.
Kevin, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about you?
Fine, thanks. Kevin is our Detroit vice chair. Vice chair, co-chair?
I don't know. I was typing co-chair and you said vice chair, and then I just I took your wording and I hit return.
And Kurt, you're the Detroit secretary, so you might want to rename yourself there.
I've got to run and get a piece of paper here. I have a feeling I'm going to want to take notes on this subject.
All right. Is it Banu?
Yes.
Where are you from? Where are you located?
Well, I'm from Turkey and I'm located in Germany, in Backnang, very close to Stuttgart. And Sebastià was co-supervisor of my master's thesis, so I didn't want to miss the chance to listen to him. Don't see each other after for a while now, so very nice to see him. And all of you guys, of course.
All right. Do we have anybody further from Detroit than Germany?
I think Banu is going to win the the commuting war here.
Yeah, I really did my best to stay alive until 1 a.m. now. Normally, I just sleep at 11. That was a great challenge to me. So it's all about timing, I guess, that not so much European people are right now here available.
Well, guess what? I just been watching the list coming in, and I see Waibao is here. Waibao used to be with me when I was chairman of the Audio Engineering Society here in LA. So Waibao, nice to see you here.
All right, people are still showing up.
I guess Waibao is muted.
Wow, even Dad has shown up. Somebody else is using Facebook for more than one purpose. I always have to rename these things based on whatever I was doing during the last meeting. All right, we're waiting for a few more minutes for folks to trickle in. I usually give them about 2 or 3 minutes. I'm looking for more folks from the Detroit session. One thing I was hoping to do was do a little bit of a quick vote. So Kevin was suggesting, hey, what if we did this meeting what if we started doing meetings instead of at 7 at night, which makes it hard for Europe to join? What if we did these things a little bit earlier in the day? And that would catch the late end of Europe. So something like 3 p.m. East Coast time, which would be 9 p.m. in Germany, and noon on the West Coast. So if you're in favor of that, go into a reaction area and give a thumbs up of doing these meetings earlier in the day. If evenings or late afternoons work better for you, then don't give a response. So we'll have a.
You said Pacific time would be noon?
Yeah, Pacific time would be noon.
Yeah, okay, I'll thumbs up that.
Yeah, some of the motivation is it used to be that we would have to like wait until after work to drive to some location to have an in-person meeting. And so it seems like participation might be better if everyone's already at a computer in the middle of the workday anyway, right? Seems like participation for evening meetings across the board is a little down, so.
All right. So we have a little bit of housekeeping to do. So All right, so how many thumbs up did we get? Oh, they're already gone.
Oh, they only last about 15 seconds.
Yeah, okay. Well,
Do it again.
I saw we had a decent amount. Yeah, give me the thumbs up again if that's a.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Okay,
8,
9 out of
7, 6.
So almost 50% gets to that region. So that's pretty good. All right. All right, so let's a little bit of housekeeping on the Detroit side for any of the local folks over here. I am going to do a very quick share screen of my notes here, and we're welcome to this meeting, which is we're trying to get a little bit more in sync and get things a little bit more active now that it's that we're able to do so. And bring in more national and international participants. So welcome to this meeting of the Detroit Society, where we are able to get together with Facebook's Sebastià and get this meeting going on the entitled Towards Audio Presence in Mixed Reality. The housekeeping items. For upcoming meetings, quick notes, we have Bill Whitlock on April 27th. In May, we're looking to get Lawrence Tech University, their program, that's a local Detroit program here, and learn a little bit more about their audio program. And then Dewey, I think you're on for June. I think I saw you pop in. So
Yep.
What's your title? What's the?
I'll think about a better title. I'll give you a response early next week. I just sent an email actually just about 5 minutes ago.
Microphones, microarrays.
It's about microphones. Yeah, it's about
Okay,
microphone kind of performance evaluation in automotive application.
Very good.
Yeah, something like that.
All right. And then, as always, we are looking for new volunteers here for our elections. So the local committee here needs to get a little bit more fresh blood into it, as well as the officers. So the titles of these positions that we hold, the chair is the guy who's inspiring all us cats. The vice chair is helping herd the cats, secretary, communications with the cats, and treasurer. Well, if we had a budget, we would be managing that, but we're currently pretty slim right now. We don't have many expenses either, so that all works out. And then the committee is probably the most important part of the society, because they're the ones that find the new speakers and getting people to come and present to us. So we're looking for some fresh blood here, so spread the word. We will be having elections coming up in the next 2 months. For this meeting, post questions in the chat area, and I will try and find some good times to interrupt or hold them till the end. Kurt, if you could at some point take a snapshot of the attendee list, just so we have a list of who is here. Sebastià, I'm just reminding you again, don't forget to share your sound when you go live with your presentation. And then I've already made you a co-host, so I've taken care of that. So anybody else have any other questions? Otherwise, we will get going. And I will stop sharing. And Sebastià, take it away whenever you're ready.
I'm going to try to share my screen, hopefully with sound. Okay. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, thanks for thinking about us and our team for this presentation. I'll try to represent them as best as I can. And yeah, I'm going to be talking about how we're thinking about audio presence in mixed realities, and that will involve a little bit of VR, but also a little bit of AR. And even before starting, I want to say that even I'm presenting this work, I've only been involved in a portion of it. So a lot of the hard work and even slides and all the credit goes to the entire audio team, and all the research is done by multiple people here. So yeah, just for a little bit of context, I'll give anyway a bit of an introduction of myself. So I started my bachelor in telecom engineering in Barcelona at the Polytechnic University. I did a short stay for my master's thesis in Norway. Then I graduated and then moved to Germany for my doctoral degree in music acoustics. And there, that was when I started to have a little bit more of contact with virtual acoustics and virtual reality. I was working there with trying to figure out how musicians react to different acoustic environments. So for that, we were measuring various stages, and then we were resynthesizing those environments in the lab, so musicians could play and hear themselves as if they were in different rooms. During that work, I did some stages, some research visits to Aalto University and Mule BBM. And then about 3 years, slightly over 3 years ago, I moved to Seattle to join the Oculus research team, which has since grown a lot, both in size and in scope. So the Oculus research team was renamed to Facebook Reality Labs, which in turn also grew again, and then it was rebranded to Facebook Related Labs Research. So we're kind of doing the same kind of research for VR, for AR, but with a lot more scope than 3 years ago. So moving into what we're trying to achieve in our team, we basically have a mission that we split in two parts. The first one is we want to create virtual sounds that are perceptually indistinguishable from reality, which means that we hear them over headphones, but they are just sound exactly the same as if they were real. And the second one is that we want to redefine human hearing. So we want to have wearable devices that allow us to have better hearing, that allow us to overcome the cocktail party problem, and allow us to basically enhance our hearing abilities. So in this talk, I will focus mostly on the first one, what it means to create virtual sounds that are perceptually indistinguishable from reality. So a very simple comparison would be having our sound over headphones, where we reproduce some source in the room. And when we're hearing that, we actually believe that we are in that room, that we're physically present in that room, and we hear everything as if we were there. So that's kind of our goal. And one of the limitations is that we need to do this in mobile devices. We have very limited compute. We have to be fast. So we many times have to rely on psychoacoustics and perceptual information to basically know where we can simplify some things and when we really have to be accurate in when we're trying to generate these virtual sounds. So that's why we say that they have to be perceptually indistinguishable from reality, but actually not necessarily physically indistinguishable. So going into what the audio chain for this whole process would be, we generally start with some source properties, some radiation patterns, some power spectrum. This source radiates into an environment, and then we have reflections, we have scattering, we have reverberation. That impinges on a listener, so we can spatialize that using our head-related transfer function, or Hrtf, and we finally have to play back over some kind of hardware, ideally binaural and equalized to the listener. So how do we approach the first two stages here? How do we model source properties and propagation? We want to do this for a wide variety of environments. We want to be fast, do it in real time, very low latency, need to be scalable. It needs to be dynamic. The environment could change. We could open and close doors. We could have an explosion and some building could just be demolished, and then we all of a sudden have a complete different environment. So how can we approach this and at the same time still have some perceptual accuracy that lets us believe that this is realistic? I will start with basically depicting, going from the very beginning of a room impulse response and an environment, and then say how we're overcoming that. So we can start with the basic room impulse response, which defines how sound propagates in a room. It gives us the energy and the time behavior of the sound in an enclosed space. And if we look at the very first event, that is generally the direct sound, unless we have some sort of occlusion or other special characteristics. But if we only render the direct sound, that just sounds highly unrealistic.
Acoustics is the interdisciplinary science that deals with the study of all mechanical waves in gases, liquids, and solids, including vibration, sound, ultrasound, and infrasound.
So generally this, even if it's played binaurally and applying some specialization, will sound generally not be externalized, like sounding very close to our head. We want to start modeling the entire room impulse response. So the next step would be starting to model specular reflections. And if we listen to that, only the reflections, you'll already hear that there is some sense of an environment here.
Acoustics is the interdisciplinary science that deals with the study of all mechanical waves in gases, liquids, and solids, including vibration, sound, ultrasound, and infrasound.
So the specular reflections usually are very related to geometry. We can find them out using either image source models or ray tracing. And as we move further into the impulse response, it becomes more randomized. It resembles more a noise signal. And this is how the reverberation would then sound.
Acoustics is the interdisciplinary science that deals with the study of all mechanical waves in gases, liquids, and solids, including vibration, sound, ultrasound, and infrasound.
So the idea is that we want to combine all of this. We want to simulate it in real time, and we want to adapt it as the environment and the listener change. And I don't know if...
Acoustics is the interdisciplinary science that deals with the study of all mechanical waves in gases, liquids, and solids, including vibration, sound, ultrasound, and infrasound.
So beware, this is a mono rendering now, so there is no any specialization, but this impulse responses was simulated using the real-time engine. So it is plausible, and it can resemble some sort of realistic environment. And then the quality obviously improves a lot when we also have dynamic environments and binaural rendering. The other thing we need to take into account is that as we move in the environment, we could find some occlusions in our sound field. So we need to stop rendering the direct sound, and instead we need to render diffraction around these objects. And this is something that we've been working on a lot lately. And there will be some publications upcoming on this topic soon. So we looked at a room, but we also want to do this into multiple rooms. So we talked about reflections and reverb, but then once we move into other environments, we also need to model transmission in between the different rooms. So we have a portion of the sound that will travel through the structures of a building. And then another thing is we want to have this dynamic. So if we close a door, some reverb and some reflections and some direct sound diffraction that would enter into the other room will actually not do it anymore, and we have to start modeling transmission instead. So these are all the sort of phenomena that we want to take into account. And then finally, as I said before, once we have computed our sound field, what we have to do is impose an Hrtf, so we can actually model the energy from the direction it's arriving from. So this is basically a big paradigm shift compared to the traditional video game and game engine sound simulation. Traditionally, what we have is sound artists defining different zones in a 3D scene, and then they will design and then they will model the reverberation and the sound of each separate space. The problem with this traditional approach is that first, we have to manually tune every single space, and second, it's very hard to deal with dynamic spaces. If something changes, we would also have the sound change, and then it really doesn't scale well with dynamic environments. So the idea here is that instead of that, we basically give sound designers the tools to build the environment, to place the geometry, to place the materials, and that is what is going to at the end generate the virtual audio. So the approach is basically that we start with some 3D geometry, we have some material properties, and then out of the box we already get some 3D sound propagation. And the algorithm right now works that it's a mix of ray tracing and artificial reverberators. So by casting rays into the environment, we can estimate the size of the room. We can estimate how the energy evolves over time, and then we can use this information to drive some reverberators that will generate the final reverb that the user hears. So now we have some sound examples here of how that would sound if we have the same geometry, but we actually just change the materials in the scene.
The acoustic materials that are present in a scene have a strong effect on the resulting sound. This is a small rectangular room with a floor made of marble tile, brick walls, and a plaster ceiling. If the walls of the room are changed to gypsum board and the floor is changed to wood, the reverberation time decreases and there are less low frequencies. If the floor is changed to carpet, the reverberation time is reduced further due to the high absorption coefficient of the carpet material.
So now we have another video where we have a player moving through a complex scene, and then we have the propagation toggling on and off. This is clearly better with binaural audio, but I hope still a lot of the propagation effects will come through on the mono audio. Okay, so cool. So yeah, I want to say that a lot of the work and simulations and videos for this part of the presentation were actually generated by Karl Schissler, who is, I would say, the great mind behind all of this propagation engine. And there is a beta version actually that can be downloaded from the Oculus webpage, and then there are integration plugins for Unity, Unreal, FMod, and Wise. So yeah, I would recommend anyone that's interested in this topic to give it a try. It's pretty easy to set up, and yeah, if there is anything else, I think both Rob and Carl are good contacts to ask for more information. So yeah, and there are some that are under review and upcoming. So a lot of what's going on under the hood is actually published. So once we know some properties about our environment, once we know how to propagate the sound in the space, we want to spatialize it using the Hrtf. And this is kind of one of the big topics in mixed realities. We know that Hrtfs are individual. We know that we want to personalize the audio, that it improves the experience. But really scaling Hrtf personalization for the consumer is kind of a hard topic. It's hot research right now. And traditionally, if you want to get your Hrtf, what you do is you go into our anechoic room, and you basically sit there for about 10 to 20 minutes, and you get measured with binaural microphones in your ears, and then with the loudspeaker arc playing sweeps from multiple locations, moving it around, so we can actually get the filters for all the directions around us. The problem is that this doesn't really scale, so we need to find other solutions. But really, what is going on? What is the Hrtf after all? So we know that as we move a source in front of us, we have changes in both interaural level differences and interaural time differences. And these are the two main cues that we use for horizontal localization. So a lot of these depend on head size. So if we have some basic information about people, we could already do some sort of personalization. But then the real trick comes with elevation. The elevation percept depends mostly on spectral cues, and that is very much related to the geometry of our ear pinna. So everyone has, I would say, significantly different ear pinna shapes, and that is right now one of the big problems in Hrtfs. How can we generate personalized Hrtfs for a variety of pinna shapes and sizes without having to measure everyone? So we can actually understand this as our hearing fingerprint, if you will. So as I said before, if we want to get our Hrtf, one of the solutions is to go into the anechoic room, have the loudspeaker play sweeps from many directions around us, and then we get our FIR filters, and we can convolve that with anechoic audio, and then we can already get some sort of sound spatialization. One of the problems with measurements is we need to have a very controlled setup. Besides being time consuming, it also is hard to place people in there and have very controlled measurement settings. So this graph is one analysis that we did while tracking listeners when they were being measured. So we have to stay in that room for about 10 to 20 minutes, and we need to stay still because we need to have the accurate angular directions from which we are being measured. And what we found is that people tend to move sometimes more than 1 centimeter. They tend to do a lot of forward and backward movement, even if we use some sort of tracking device to try to keep everyone in the space. And then we also have a lot of rotation. And here we could assume also that with the forward and backward leaning, we also have some sort of rotation on the pitch or around this axis. So it only looks like 2 degrees here, but when we look at how the Hrtf change with about 2 degrees of difference, we see that at higher frequencies, when we start having these notches that actually define the elevation of sources, we start having pretty big deviations from the previous measurements. So we really need to have ground truth data that we can trust, and we can use this data to do research. We really need to get clean data, and we really need to have a very controlled setup. So what we're doing right now is we have listeners or subjects aligned with multiple lasers. We have this kind of headrest, and we are also tracking their head, so we can also know if they are moving or not. And then that provides us very clean data that we can either discard if it's not good enough, or we can correct if we can compensate for some head movements. So why are we doing all this? We want this to scale, and one of the solutions is actually, what if we could just have some video, short video, and some selfies? We could apply some machine learning algorithms and then end up with an Hrtf for whatever subject. So we need to generate lots of data, we need to measure lots of people, and we need to have very reliable ground truth data. So that's why we're doing all this hassle of measuring people in this very controlled environment. But another question is, really, do we really need individualized Hrtfs? Is it really better or not? So this is our hypothesis of performance versus data availability. We hypothesize that the lowest performance comes with generic Hrtfs. Then the highest performance is just ground truth, our open ears, how we're here in the world. But then our true personalized Hrtf, which would be measured in the lab. And we hope that the personalized Hrtf actually approaches the performance in terms of localization and timbre that we have in ground truth when listening to real sources. But around here, we could have some other models. We could have machine learned models. We could also have sparse representations that just have lower spatial resolution. So we're trying to figure out really how close we need to get to our ground truth or to the real Hrtf. So one way to do that is doing localization studies, where we actually have real sources, loudspeakers placed in the room, and we also have virtual sources, which are Hrtfs. And then we can compare how good are we localizing the real sources and how good are we localizing the virtual sources. And then by trying to reduce this gap, trying to get closer to the true localization, we know that we're doing a good job in synthesizing these personalized Hrtfs. So we have here the listener inside of this brown dome, which is an acoustically transparent cloth. So they cannot see the loudspeakers. And with they have a head-mounted laser, and with the head, they basically point where they think the sound is coming to, or coming from. So what we see is that for azimuths, the errors are already pretty low with generic HRTFs. I mean, everyone has kind of a considerably similar head size, even though it gets quite better with ground truth, and then individual is kind of in the middle. But when we look at elevation, this is where we actually see a big difference. And we see that between generic and individually measured, the gap is already reducing by 10 degrees. And then it's further reduced when we go to the ground truth. And we can attribute some of these differences also to the measurement procedure, to the experimental procedure, equalization of headphones, placement of the listeners in the experiment, and so on. And but yeah, these individual localization results are pretty comparable to other available studies in the literature. So now that we know that we get some gains from individual HRTFs, really how dense do we want these HRTFs? So what we did was another study where we were using less spatial directions for the HRTF rendering, and we were actually just interpolating the spectrum of the HRTFs using barycentric interpolation in this case. And we compared how much better is the localization using a more dense representation as compared to one that is about 20 times more sparse. And what we saw actually is that with HRTFs that only have about 84 directions, we don't really gain much above that. So we can use sparse measurements and we can use interpolation, and then we already get pretty good results. If we go lower than that, we still see some decrease in performance, but that even with very sparse HRTFs, that is still much better than localization with generic HRTFs. So yeah, we know that we gain quite a bit from personalized HRTFs, and that is especially on the perception of elevation, where we have a lot of these spectral cues. But another question is, well, we know that they can be sparse, but still it's an FIR filter. It still has thousands of taps, or generally they would go down to 512, 256 taps. But it's still a lot of data that we have to either measure or estimate in some way. So can we perceptually simplify it? Can we go from this strange monster that represents an HRTF to a more cute and simple monster that would be kind of a simplified HRTF, but still perceptually accurate? So some people in our group conducted a few studies where they tried to find what is the actual perceptually relevant information in the HRTF. So the first study was trying to combine different HRTFs to create a sort of Frankenstein HRTF that would contain information from different directions for each of the bands. For example, we could have one direction for this band, then we pick the HRTF for another direction in this band, we pick the HRTF for another direction in this band, and so on. So we kind of keep building HRTFs that don't exist in reality, and then we do a localization experiment. And from getting the localization data, we can actually infer what are the bands that are more important for us perceptually. If we have a lot of information in some band, this band will dominate over the other ones when we do a perceptual experiment. So what was interesting in this experiment is that we saw that there are basically two bands that seem to be perceptually quite relevant. One is about 6 kilohertz. These are for two different directions, so the experiment was done at multiple directions. And we find this band around 6 kilohertz, and then we find another one that is less important, but is also kind of popping out in both cases around 950 hertz. So what do we have in these two bands? What we see about 950 hertz is that we have a lot of different subjects. These are HRTFs for different subjects, and we see that the magnitude at this band kind of follows a very similar trend for all of the subjects. And around this band, what we have many times is information related to the torso and the shoulder reflections. And about the 6 kilohertz band, again, we see that a lot of the subjects have a very similar trend, kind of going up and then kind of flattening at the edges. And around this band, what we have is the first notch in the HRTF, which is a notch that is commonly related to the distance between our ear helix and the entrance of the ear canal. So if we're able to model some of these features accurately, we might already get HRTFs that are perceptually accurate without having to measure everything. We just need to have some information about the listeners. And even when we don't get it so right, we also want to understand if we don't have the right HRTF, can we actually identify it? Can we actually realize that this HRTF is not our HRTF and it's just something else that's being placed there? So we know that we're pretty good at adapting to different HRTFs. So there are some studies that show that over a period of a few weeks, people can adapt to a new HRTF. They were adding a little bit of plastic implants or rubber implants on the ear, and then they were having people just go about with them for a few weeks and then do localization studies. And what they found is that we can adapt to a new HRTF. But our question is, can we actually have two HRTFs coexisting? Can we train ourselves with for a virtual HRTF, and can that feel as realistic as our real HRTF at the end? So what we prepared here was a study where we presented people in VR with 3 sources, so they could see a little ball in 3 different positions, and those were virtual sounds generated with 2 individual HRTFs and with 1 non-individual HRTF. And we wanted to ask people to identify which of the sounds was different. So if they hear to 2 individual HRTFs and 1 non-individual HRTF, are they able to reliably say this is worse than the other ones? So we first did some selection tasks to determine what were good, medium, and bad HRTFs for everyone. So trying to determine the quality of the fit. And then we had this VR experiment where we asked people to identify which of the 3 sources was actually not their individualized HRTF. So what we found was pretty interesting. We found that there were basically 2 groups. One group was generally pretty bad at identifying that there was one HRTF that wasn't personalized. So this is kind of good news for part of the users. We can have part of the users that with some visual stimulus already don't need a lot of HRTF personalization. But then we have another group that performs much better, and they very reliably are able to identify that this is not their true HRTF, and that even when the match is in the middle quality section, or even with a good match, some people are able to identify that they are not using their personalized HRTF. So we looked further into what was some differences in these groups, and one of the differences that was quite evident was in the hearing thresholds for these listeners. So we saw that in the low performance group, there was a lot more of hearing loss at higher frequencies. So this gives us some more insights as to how we could personalize HRTFs, how much we need to do it, and in what cases it matters and in what cases it doesn't. But we're still, when talking about HRTF, now in this case, we're talking about an anechoic environment. And in the real world, we also have reverberation, and we have basically room acoustics going on. So I will talk about that later, and here is some of the research. There are a few more papers also coming up on this HRTF work, especially on the perceptual side. And now I want to move to the last section, when we kind of put together both propagation and HRTF, and we try to compare against real sources, and we try to understand what is it that makes sources perceptually indistinguishable from reality. So here I like to approach the problem as a very one-dimensional simplified axis, where we have cartoonish representations of the sound field. When we hear this, or when we see this picture, we already know this is not real. So this is some simplification or some cartoonish representation. And at the other side of the quality axis, we have authentic percepts. So these are sounds that feel as real as real sources. In this case, that would be the image of this kid, looks exactly as the original image of the kid. But this is kind of a long way in between. And in between somewhere, we have what we call plausible percepts. This kit looks pretty similar to this kit. We would say, yeah, it's the same kit. But when we put them side by side, we see that the facial expression is a little bit different. One eye is more open, the mouth is a little bit more smiling in this picture. And we think that somewhere around these authentic and plausible areas is where the target for virtual sounds must be. We need to have a virtual sound that can integrate within our real environment, that can coexist with real sources, but we will be never able to A/B a real and a virtual sound on the spot. So we might have some leeway in there. We don't need to get everything exactly right. And this is what we're trying to figure out. Where can we do these simplifications? We can also map this to the mixed realities axis, for example. In real reality, everything is authentic. All the sounds are real, so all the sounds have the natural room properties. We always use our natural true Hrtf. And then once we start moving on towards the mixed realities axis, when we go into augmented reality, we have some elements that are not real. So we have this robot here, and this robot needs to have some properties from the real environment. It needs to have some propagation that is close enough to the real room properties of the room. We also need to have a good enough Hrtf model, so we can actually think that that these robot sounds belong to the real environment. Then we have augmented virtuality, where most of our environment is virtual, but we only have a few real elements passing through. And then once we move completely to virtual reality, there's nothing that prevents us from having a cartoonish representation of the world. We could bend the physics. We could have some phenomena that really don't happen in the real world. But as long as we have some sort of coherent soundscape, we might already believe that this is good enough, and we can get adapted to that virtual world. So where we have the kind of quality threshold to meet is where we go to augmented reality, where we want both the real and the virtual sound, the real and the virtual worlds to integrate seamlessly. So one thing that I haven't talked about yet is if we are talking about augmented reality, every sound that we play needs to have the acoustic properties of the space we are in. And we know that geometry, materials of spaces generate very different room impulse responses. So we need to have a way to identify what kind of a space we're in, so we can then drive our simulation engine, and we can tell the simulation engine, well, these are the reverberation targets, these are the clarity or direct to reverberant ratio, any kind of room parameter targets that we need to meet. This is our geometry, these are our materials, and so we can actually get a simulation that is close enough to the real room where we are in. So when we go to hearable devices, when we have very limited compute, we cannot always just scan the room and tag all the materials and get a very accurate representation. Sometimes we just have to rely on ambient sound, get some signals of opportunity, and then from these signals, usually from multi-channel microphone arrays, we can derive some interesting and useful properties of the room we are in. So we would usually try to estimate what is the reverberation time of the room, what is the direct to reverberant ratio, so we can get the accurate distance between us and the virtual sound. So at the end, we can go to our simulation engine and say, well, this is the impulse response that we want to generate. And the idea is that we need to do this also dynamically. We need to move into different environments, and it needs to be fast enough so we can just present virtual sounds wherever we are without having to build a model for every space we are in. So this is pretty much work in progress. This is a long-term research, and one thing that we're trying to understand now is really how close do we need to get, how good do we need to match the room to the real space. So for that, we start working with measurements. So one of the tools that we've been using a lot is this spatial decomposition method. There are others like ambisonics and other parametric methods that we could also use. But so far, we've developed some experiments using this one. So what we can do is we design the microphone array, and then we can extract the directional information from our space. So this is a 3D representation of a room where we have a loudspeaker here marked in black. And we have our microphone array here at the center of this hedgehog pattern. And here, every one of these spikes basically represents sound energy that is arriving from these directions. And so using this information, what we can do later is basically superimpose our Hrtf information. We can respatialize that. We can do it in real time, and we can convolve any kind of anechoic sounds. So at the end, what we have is virtual sound that tries to replicate the actual properties of the space we are in. So this is a picture of one experiment that we ran some time ago. And the idea here was to have listeners identify whether they were listening to the loudspeaker or they were listening to virtual sounds coming over headphones. And we've seen that if we have individualized Hrtfs, if we have high quality room impulse response measurements, we can get very close. But then there is always another problem, which is how we are doing the real-time rendering, how we are setting up our system, the latency, the quality of the tracking. So all these are other factors that we need to take into account whenever we run these kind of experiments. So one experiment that I'll go more in detail is we have listeners sitting in a room, and then we have loudspeakers behind this curtain, and we have the same exercise. We are playing some sound to a listener, and we're asking them, is this coming from the loudspeaker behind the curtain, or is it actually coming from your headphones? And so what we can do is manipulate this rendering, deviate it from the actual room acoustic properties of the real space, and see how far we can go, see how much leeway we can have when we render our vulture sounds, and how much we can degrade them. So then we can set the quality thresholds for our simulations. So one of the first experiments that we did in this avenue was simplifying how much spatial resolution we have in the impulse response, similar to what we did with the Hrtf. So here we have the actual impulse response of the room. And then we have different degrees of spatial resolution that we were using to render these impulse responses. We were always keeping the resolution of the direct sound as high as possible, because we don't want the direct sound to just jump around, but we want to know how much resolution we need for the acoustics themselves. So what we found is that these are plausibility scores, which basically means when we ask a listener, is this a real or a virtual sound, they reply real. So when they reply real, that's basically trending towards 1. And what we saw is that when we have more than 14 directions for rendering out the reverb, then virtual sounds, all of these, are already as perceived as being as plausible as the real loudspeaker. So we know that we can have a lot of simplification in the amount of spatial resolution that we render our virtual sounds. But we also know that when we go below 14 DOA, we risk our sounds not being perceived as realistic as real sounds. So you can already see that using this kind of approximation, we can, or this kind of approach, we can already explore many of the parameters. So another parameter that we explored was how much can we deviate from the actual reverberation time of the room. So same experiment. We have listeners in the space. We ask them, are you hearing a real source or are you hearing a virtual source? And then in this case, what we do is modify the reverberation time of our renderings. So if we look here, always around 90% to 110%, the renderings are perceived as externalized as the real loudspeaker. But then when we go further out of those bounds, then things start to degrade. We also see that this depends on the kind of signal that we use. So for speech, longer reverberation times are worse tolerated than shorter reverberation times. And for castanets, for example, shorter reverberation times are very badly tolerated. So we also have a bit more of information about what kind of signal we're rendering and what is the quality that we need to meet for this signal. And if you recall, I talked before about we're trying to estimate the reverberation time by only using signals that we have in our environment. So this work basically informs how good our algorithms need to be there to be able to generate sounds that are seamlessly blending with real sources. So another way of doing this would be using variable acoustics environments where we can actually open and close panels. And what we know in this case is that the modifications that we are doing are physically possible. We just change the material properties of the room, and then we get a different room impulse response. So what we tried to do in this experiment was figuring out what are the just noticeable differences for reverberation in this kind of augmented reality context. So there is some just noticeable difference work in room acoustics for concert halls, but that's pretty arbitrary. It just defines a 5% and saying that that's just the just noticeable difference, but it doesn't distinguish between the kind of room, the context, or the stimuli that we're using. So here what we try to do is have sources playing from different directions with different reverberation times, and then have listeners identify which of the sources has a different reverberation time. So we can have very fine control over figuring out how much we can deviate again. And this was an experiment we did in VR. So we measured the room in many different positions, and then we had people seeing the room, sitting in the actual room, but seeing the room in the VR headset and using binaural reproduction. So we wouldn't need to move the panels between stimuli, but we could just use virtual sound. So this is still pretty much work in progress. We've run some pilots, and we're going to publish something in a conference soon. But there is a lot more to come here, and this is still very early stages work. And then one of the main elements that I showed so far for high quality rendering is that we only have 3 degrees of freedom. We can rotate our heads, but we cannot really move around in the environment. So that is another area where we're doing some research. We want to set up systems that allow us to navigate an environment, move freely in that environment, and then also modify that to figure out how much we can deviate from the actual reality. So this is a setup that we had in a room where we measured many different points, and then we set up a system with optical tracking that was basically swapping between the different simulated or measured actually and resynthesized impulse responses in real time. So we can have a navigable environment and kind of try to aim for the higher quality. So this is basically a lot of what we call time machines, which are basically systems that we know are not going to be deployed to anything that's consumer facing, but it's basically research. And we want to use these systems to understand how good we need to do our renderings. I forgot to mention before on the previous experiments, we had released 2 open source repositories on the resynthesis of the binaural impulse responses using SDM. We did some improvements over the original algorithm. And we've also released an open source repository to do this 6DOF environment using either multi-channel impulse responses or using only omnidirectional responses. So when we use an omnidirectional response, if we have some information about the environment, in this case, the geometry and the size, we can build a geometric model. We can feed that to our measurement, and we can then update our geometric model as we move around in the room. So this is also pretty much work in progress, and these are the publications that are related to room estimation and all these real virtual comparison experiments. So I think we're pretty much close to an hour, and this is a lot of the content that I've prepared for this presentation. But some time ago, we had some blog post in the Facebook blog that details a lot more about our work both for audio presence, but also for superhuman hearing. And since I didn't talk at all about superhuman hearing or audio superpowers, if you go to this blog post, you can find more about what we've been doing during the last years. So yeah, I think with this I'm done. Thank you all of you for attending, for your attention, but also thanks to all the audio team for providing slides, for doing all the work. And as I said before, I'm just the messenger, but here a lot of the work is basically from the rest of the audio team. So yeah, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to start a discussion, answer some questions, and go deeper in any of the topics that you found interesting.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks so much. That was very enlightening. Very great to see the kind of where you guys are and the things that you've been working on. Let's see, we had one question that was kind of answered immediately after it was posted. Till was saying, what do you think about the adaption of HRTF? So how humans adapt to somebody else's HRTF. I've often, wondered, hey, if everybody got their ears chopped off and we could all get, standardized ears pin put on us, we would all be able to solve this thing a lot more easily. That's not the case. They're like fingerprints, like you put. I like that analogy. But did you do any studies about how quickly people adapt to somebody else's pinna?
Mm-hmm. So I didn't have the references. We didn't do any work ourselves on this. We kind of picked up where other people left in this aspect. And I didn't have the references, but there are some studies, and people were getting close, I think, to their natural HRTF after a few weeks with using implants in their pinnas. And then when they were removing the implants, they very quickly were able to get back to their original HRTF. So that kind of suggested that people don't forget their HRTF, but they're also able to learn the new one. What we don't know is if we can actually have the two models coexist. So can you actually learn the new HRTF, have your VR HRTF or your mixed reality HRTF coexist with your real HRTF? If we can do that, then we don't need to model the HRTF as good as we thought at the end.
Yeah, okay, that's yeah, that would agree. I guess doing work in insert ears, like doing stage monitoring things where you're both doing a live mix and doing a mix of the rest of the stage, we found that it took probably about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the degree of occlusion that you disturbed your pinna. So basically, if the less you disturb your pinna, the smaller you got your in-ear monitor going, the easier and the faster you were able to adapt to it. So yeah, it'd be interesting if you see similar results.
Yeah, and it's interesting also that something similar happens with room acoustics. So the people from the Technical University in Ilmenau have done a lot of work on what they call the room divergence effect, which is basically when we're listening to a binaural recording that has been recorded somewhere else, it usually just doesn't sound good. But when you actually listen to it in the room you recorded it, then it sounds amazing.
Yeah.
And that's why we try to match the real room. But what they found is that if you're actually getting exposed to that without being exposed to the real acoustics, it can kind of starts getting better and better, especially if you have tracking and so on. But then as soon as you get exposed to the real room again, that collapses. So that's another thing. Can we actually train the room and somehow maintain also the real and the virtual model? I think that's a pretty much unexplored question.
Yeah, so a lot of the applications you say, people look at this and say, yeah, that's for gaming or something like that. And but I wonder if you've worked a little bit further to find, if you had to present to your management to say, what's the cost benefit of all this work as far as basic communications? If you look at Facebook's mission of connecting people, they're probably looking to say, okay, how does this actually help connect people? When does it become a practical result? And for somebody who hasn't really experienced what you get with your personal HRTF and with head tracking, that's when you get the full externalization and the full accuracy. How do you, are you able to find a way to quantify that or find a cost benefit to say, this is the amount of improvement in performance parameter X you get if you go to this level? Did you ever have to reduce it to that point?
I would say that when we go to more communication-oriented applications, one of the applications would even be video calls. Like if we have some spatial separation between speakers, we already gain intelligibility because of binaural unmasking. So that's, and especially in the recent context, that's kind of a very obvious application. But also just trying to get closer to reality unlocks a lot of psychoacoustical studies that wouldn't be otherwise impractical. If we have to move between different environments to perform some sort of studies, then that makes a lot of the research impractical. So I would like to see these as kind of side effects. We're trying to get some products out, but a lot of the research that we're doing in the meanwhile also lets us understand better how we hear and how we can leverage all these technologies for other more basic research.
Yeah, it's that like the aspect of, as you said in conference call, you'd like to separate everybody, but does it matter whether they're separated inside your head or if you can actually put the perception out in front of you? You can say, yeah, it's less fatiguing. How less fatiguing is it? Put a number on that. And that's where I have a hard time trying to, communicate to people that it's worth it to go that far. So it'd be interesting if you were able to quantify that.
I would say that a lot of these applications come in what we call the audio superpowers aspect, where we want to overcome the cocktail party problem and so on. And in those scenarios, we can measure what is the benefit in speech intelligibility of having an increase of X dBs in SNR. So for those more kind of, I would say, conversational social environments, we have some paradigms that have been developed in the past and are pretty well tested in lab environments. For the more presence, what we call it, or a kind of immersive audio experience, I would think that this has been always very much linked to entertainment. So it's always very linked to the quality of experience, which might be very subjective at some point. But what we really know is that in that test that I showed before, where we try to find if a source is real or virtual, we had just people coming and listen to it over headphones. And then at some point we were like, okay, remove the headphones. And then they removed the headphones. They realized the sound was coming from the headphones and not from the speaker. And then you get that shock.
Wow.
Which is kind of a binary metric at the end. It's either you get the wow effect or you don't. So it's very hard to put the line in between. But there is some work also from Aalto. They're trying what they call transfer plausibility, which is trying to assess how good virtual and real sources blend together, not just A being a real versus a virtual, but having a complex soundscape, and then trying to see having different degrees of quality in that soundscape, and then trying to pinpoint which of the sources are real and which sources are not. And then we can have some sort of matching with different parameters and see what's important and what's not. But yeah, it boils down at the end to some very subjective experience. What feels real to you, and what is the benefit of something feeling real?
So Francis asks, earlier when you do room acoustic simulations, you had mentioned that ray tracing was used. My question is, the ray tracing was done in real time. That's amazing. How many reflections per ray was allowed?
Okay. So I don't know how much I can give away the details on this one, because that's something that's already public facing and so on. I know we're going to be publishing a lot related to this soon. So that's one of the answers I can give. The other one is obviously not, the impulse response is not constructed directly using ray tracing. We can use the rays we cast rays to understand what's the environment, to understand what are the materials, and to understand what is the geometry of the environment. And then from the information that we get back from the ray tracing, we can use that to estimate parameters, and then we can drive reverberators using those parameters. So it's kind of a two-step. We use the rays to explore the environment, and then we use that information to drive the reverberation process.
Let's see, looking for other questions. So Sony 360, they've kind of tried to do a little bit something similar with taking pictures of the ear and the pinna, and I think a few other folks have done that. Are you more successful or as successful? Has there been like a leap in ability there?
I mean, this is pretty much research in progress right now. So yeah, there are a few algorithms out there. I think Embody VR is also doing it. Is a company, I think, from the West Coast in the US. Genelec also acquired a company, and they are also doing that. I don't know to what extent those solutions get very close to your real Hrtf. I know Sony is also doing some Hrtf selection in some sort of process to give you the best match within a database. So there are many different solutions to do that, and we're also exploring a lot of them. But yeah, this is definitely research in progress right now.
Yeah, way back when in the 90s when we were doing binaural simulations, if you used a real person, it was always better than using a plastic ear or anything else that was slightly unnatural. So that goes to the database selection.
Yeah.
What headphones did you use? Were those stacks? What were you had some slightly open?
Yeah, for those real virtual experiments, we used the AKG K1000, which have been discontinued for a long time, but we found they are quite non-occlusive. They still have some problems. People from Cologne actually did measurements, and they have a very detailed explanation of the directions where it makes most effect. But it's still pretty good and pretty non-occluding. And then another thing that you can always do is measure your Hrtfs with the headphones on, which is, I mean, it's laborious and it's not fun, but it can be done if you really want to get it right.
If you're already if you already have something stuck in your ear, you might as well measure the headphone at that time too. Yeah. Good. Other folks, anything else? So with the you had the visual screen then with your room simulation. So were you able to accurately try doing a matching exercise where you swapped the visual room with the simulated room, and see which one was dominant on what people were perceiving? Did you try anything like that at any point?
No. A lot of the experiments where we had room acoustics were actually using this real virtual setup. So we were usually not moving between different spaces. In the last experiment that I showed, where I talked about the variable acoustics room, we did 360 captures in that room, and we also did 360 captures in 2 more rooms. We were about to start experiments, and then COVID hit, and then basically we stopped. This was some work that our former intern from Ilmenau, Florian Klein, he was doing it. And yeah, then in the middle of his internship, we had to kind of rethink our approach.
Yeah. All right. Anything else? I think that's. Oh yeah, somebody was asking if you could provide slides. If this slide deck could be provided. I mean, we have the recording, but it might be just easier.
I can ask about this. I'm not sure, but yeah, I can ask.
Okay, and double check on that recording. Make sure that that's okay as well.
I see Juan says he has a question.
Yeah, hi Sebastià. Thank you for the talk. That's really advanced and impressive. Thank you for the insights.
Thank you.
In my experience in virtual reality experiments, we often lack background noise, and that's something that we are very used to in everyday life. Whenever we are in a vehicle, we we are in sound insulated rooms, and attendance being is far from the reality. Have you done any experiments, and did you include background noises can be handled from mechanical surfaces or from the outside world? Have you any experience with this?
That's a real good point. We have not introduced them like explicitly. We've done some experiments where we had some sort of informal setup where we could have multiple people in the room and someone was trying to identify a real loudspeaker from a virtual when some other people were there just kind of hanging out. But yeah, we haven't really done it in noisy environments, but I think it's a really good point.
Okay, anything else? All right, well, on behalf of Detroit and all the attendees here visiting, I wanted to say thank you again. This was a fabulous presentation. Can't wait till we can get together in person and have an AES conference on this or something a little bit more focused where we can get a lot more people together in the same room. Might even be worth a virtual conference. But yeah, we're in the we know that everybody has other commitments this afternoon, this evening. But thanks very much for everybody for attending. Like I said, we have our next meeting April 27th with Bill Whitlock, and I don't know, we might experiment with moving it up to a time where Europe can get in, and it'll be a little bit easier for everybody. So with that, yeah, thank you very much again. If anybody runs into Sebastià in person, buy him a beer. And
right, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And yeah, thanks, David, for the.
Okay, and thanks to all your team at Facebook and for allowing you to share all this. It's very helpful, very informative, very enlightening. So,
thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, have a good evening, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.